Okay, so today let's talk about the motor system. Today we're going to cover basically what is going on in the spinal cord, what is going on from the various tracts that are contributing to the motor movement in the spinal cord, and then we're going to talk about the cortical areas that are involved in motor system in terms of like motor planning. Okay, so this is the motor control hierarchy. So the way that you kind of think about motor system is that there are several levels of planning, and in terms of the function, you can think of it as the high level of planning are the one that are involving with the strategy. So there are a lot of thinking that are involved with it. And so these are the structures that are involved, such as the posterior parietal lobe, the, the prefrontal lobe, the anterior interparietal areas. And now in the frontal part, you got thing places like the premotor area, the supplementary motor area. So all of these are involved with the strategic planning of movement. And then now in the middle level, basically you have the function that are involved with tactics. So these are the areas that are more involved with M1 and also the cerebellum. Okay, and then the next level is like the lowest level, which dealing only with the execution aspect. And then so these are the places such as the brainstem, the spinal cord structures. So basically these areas have no involvement with the planning. They just kind of are faithful um, representative of the places which kind of execute the commands. So these are more like the soldiers in the army. So these are not like the strategic room kind of places. So they just kind of merely follow the order of what is coming through when it comes to like the M1. Okay. So now, so let's talk about the motor system in when it comes to the spinal cord. Okay, so when you go to a doctor and then when they hit you with this hammer, right, and then just kind of hitting where the with that hammer stretches that with the quadriceps, and basically this is going to create a, a reflex and in which that is going to send the sensory neuron from the muscle spindle and to your dorsal root of your spinal cord. And then so you see that this information comes this way and then synapse onto this sensory neuron dorsal root area. And then from there, this is going to synapse directly back to the alpha motor neuron, and then this is going to go back to the muscle, and this is how you have a stretch, a reflex basically. So then what happens is that this alpha neuron, so whenever you hear the word alpha neuron, you know that this is basically a very low level um, reflex-ish neuronal control when it comes to the motor command. So whenever people say something like alpha neuron disease, or if they say something like lower neuron disease, they mean that this is happening at the spinal cord level. Okay. Now let's take a look at what happens when you have trying to make a movement. Now let's just make like the easiest movement when it comes to the flexion and extension of the elbow. So what happens when you want to make a movement? Then what is happening is basically the alpha neuron is going to start firing in the spinal cord, and then this is going to make the muscle fibers shorter. Okay, and so whenever the alpha neuron fires, it's going to make the corresponding area for the muscle to be shorter. And so let's say if you want to make a muscle to kind of show off your tricep to see how well you have been doing in the gym, then basically this the alpha neuron fires, and then the muscle are going to get shorter, and then the corresponding area is going to become basically shorter and enlarged. And so in this case, when you have the flexion of the elbow, then you can see that the bicep areas, when you look at them in terms of the EMG, you're going to see a lot of activities, but the opposing muscles, the tricep, you don't see that much activities. Now, when it comes to the extension of the elbow, which is the opposite movement, and basically you see the opposite effect. You see that the bicep does not fire that much when you look at their EMG, but then the tricep is firing a lot when you look at their EMG. Now, when it comes to the descending motor tracks, when you look at a cross section of the actual spinal cord, you see that there are many areas. So you see there are two lateral pathways. One is the corticospinal tract, and another one is the rubospinal tract. And then you got the ventral medial pathways, and that consists of many motor tracks. So you got the tectospinal tract, you got the vestibulospinal tract, you got the pontine reticulospinal tract, and you get the medullary reticulospinal tracts. So all of these tracts that are really important for each kind of the motor movement when it's involved, when you are trying to look at the smooth operation when it comes to the motor command. So the descending spinal tract, we just kind of list a little bit of them. And so make sure you know this for your exams. So the first one is going to be the cortical spinal tract, and this is very important for motor execution. So these are not just motor execution, but these are fine and gross motor execution. And so when you are trying to do something that's very fine, fine-tuned this kind of motor execution, such as if you're trying to make if you're trying to braid someone's hair, for instance, or if you are trying to sew, these kind of very fine motor execution, and including some of the gross movements, all of these are being guided by your corticospinal tract, basically. And then the second one is the rubospinal tract. So this originates from the red nucleus in the midbrain, and these are very important for the gross movement. So when you're trying to make a very big movement, the rubospinal tract really initiate all of these gross big movement. And then the third one is the tectospinal tract. So this is really this tecto basically means this is somewhere coming from somewhere in the tectum. So this is coming from the superior colliculus, and so the superior colliculus is going to give rise to things like functions such as eye muscle movements or the head position coordination. So when you're moving your eyes to the left, to the right, where you're trying to make a movement like this, these are all being guided by the tectospinal tract. And then there is the vestibulospinal tract. So this is important for the stability and eyesight coordination between vestibular system and the visual system. So this is basically has to do with when you are kind of tilting your head to kind of make sure that you are still seeing what you are seeing in the right, and while kind of keeping your balance. And the last one is the reticulospinal tract. So this has to do with the gravity and anti-gravity flexes in the reflexes of the spinal cord. So this is kind of making sure that when you are taking your steps, that your sense of balance is still intact, that you are not falling one way with the other. So this is also a very important aspect. Okay. Now let's take a look at the cortical spinal tract. Okay, so the cortical spinal tract originates in M1. Okay, you can see, and then this is going to go down through the corona radiata, and then they're going to form part of the internal capsule, and then they're going to go through this area, basically through this place, the pons, and then you can see that. So this is going to form in the base of the cerebral peduncle, and then they're going to go to the medulla part, And then the medulla part, then this is when they make their decussation, which means goes from the right to the left, or from the left to the right of the part of the body. And then when they go through the medullary um, pyramid, so which means that they're going to form something called the pyramidal decussation, and then they're going to make their first synapse when it comes to the spinal cord. So this is where so this is when they make the first synapse onto those alpha neurons that we talked about in the spinal cord. So now this is one of the longest so this is the one of the longest axons that you can see. So you can see that the cell body originates in the primary motor cortex and ends all the way in the spinal cord. Now, when the part that kind of controls the lower body, can you kind of imagine how long it is? So this the axon of that actually goes longer than 1 meter. Okay, so this is a very, very long axons in your body. Now let's also take a look at some of the tectospinal tract and also the vestibular tract. So you can see that these also goes to the spinal cord. So in terms of the vestibular spinal tract, it originates in the vestibular nucleus and then descends down to the spinal cord, as you can see. And when it comes to the tecto spinal tract, and see, as you can see that it originates in the midbrain in the superior colliculus, and it goes all the way down through the medulla part, and then it's going to make its synapse in the uh, in in the spinal cord. Okay. And when it comes to the pontine reticular formation, so this basically is going to form the reticular spinal tract. So you can see that the cells originate from the pontine reticular formation, and they're going to send down their axons here, what you see in red, and then eventually it's going to go down to synapse onto the spinal cord. And then when it comes to the and then the second part of that is going to be coming from the medullary reticular formation. So you got two aspects. You got the pontine reticular formation, and you got the medullary reticular formation. I mean, either way, they're coming from the reticular formation complexes. Okay, so you can see that both of these are going to form into the reticular spinal tract, and then they're together. They're going to synapse onto the spinal cord. Okay. Now let's talk about something that you are going to hear a lot later on if you become a motor cortex, or I mean like a motor expert, or if when you become a neurologist. So something like you hear a lot is a pyramidal tract or extrapyramidal tract. So pyramidal tract basically is talking about anything that is coming from the primary motor cortex, and which forms later on, you can see the axon of that forms the cortical spinal tract. And then so whenever you hear pyramidal tract, it's basically talking about cortical spinal tract. And then whenever you're hearing extra pyramidal tract, extra meaning outside of, so extra pyramidal tract, this is everything that controls motor movement other than the cortical spinal tract. And then you're probably thinking, why is it called pyramidals? Because when the cortical spinal tract make their decussations near the medullary part, they form something that looks like the pyramid. And then this is not the case with all of these other tracts, such as the rubospinal tract, the tectospinal tract. So they don't form these kind of they don't form part of these pyramidal tract. So this is why they're called the extrapyramidal tract. All right, so you can see that. So this is basically kind of tells you that everything that is outside, other than the cortical spinal tract, are called the extrapyramidal tract. So this is the summary that kind of tells you what is going on when it comes to the motor control and how it forms like the later tracks. So you can see that M1 is going to make its synapse into many areas, they have, but the final destination is always going to be the spinal cord. And you can see that this direct pathway that you see here, this is the cortical spinal tract. And then, and then some of them are going to synapse first onto the red nucleus, and then this is going to form the rubospinal tract here, okay? And then the caudal spinal tract and the rubospinal tract together, they're going to form the lateral pathways. Now, in the ventromedial pathways, you can see that the M1 is going to signal the reticular formation, and/or it's going to signal the supracolliculus as well as the vestibular nuclei, and then it's going to form the reticular spinal tract, as well as the vestibular tract, the vestibular spinal tract, as well as the technospinal tract. Now, in the previous slides, we've talked about how the muscles react to the alpha motor neuron enlistment or the recruitment of that. And then we have also talked about how the upper motor neuron, meaning coming from all of these CNS, like upper part, how that enlists in the activity that's in the spinal cord, because we talked about many different kinds of the spinal cord tracks that are being recruited by all these areas, right? Now, let's talk about each individual areas that are in the cerebral cortex and what they do. Okay, so in the cortical motor areas, basically you have many areas. You got things such as the supplemental motor area, and then you got the premotor area, and you got the primary motor cortex, and you also got the posterior parietal lobe as well as the dorsal-medial prefrontal cortex. So now the supplemental motor area is really really important for distal muscle planning, as opposed to the premotor area is very important for the proximal muscle planning. Now, when you kind of want to get an idea of what the M1 does, as something we said before, this has to deal with the tactic and the execution of the motor output. Now, when it comes to the actual planning, so the strategic room of action, that this is actually being done by two areas. This is being done by the prefrontal cortex as well as the posterior parietal cortex. So these are the highest level of the motor planning that are involved. So let's take a look at where all of these areas that we're basically talking about. So now we have talked about the prefrontal cortex as well as posterior parietal cortex. These two areas are involved with the highest planning when it comes to the motor initiation. And then next level down, then you get areas that are the supplemental motor area as well as the premotor area. These are very important dealing with the actual premotor planning aspect. Okay, and then the next area that are involved, as you can see, this is the area that's more involved with tactic and also the execution. This is the primary motor cortex. Okay, so these are, you can see that all of these areas are involved in the motor control, and then they're also involved when it comes to so these are all the cortical areas that are involved in motor control, basically. Now, in the primary motor cortex, you have something called the homunculus. So the homunculus is something we talked about before. It resembles a very good topographic areas when it comes to the M1. So now, how does it kind of works is that, let's say if you have an electrode stick to here and you pass an electric current through it, and then what you're going to see for this person is that their hand is going to move. And then let's say if you have another electrode going through here, this area that's responsible for the jaw movement, and you pass an electric current through it, then what you're going to see is that this jaw is his or her jaw is going to move. And then this person is going to tell you, well, but I didn't kind of plan for this jaw to move, and how come it's still moving? Because what you're doing is you are artificially creating an environment that kind of suggests to to have the neurons underneath here or underneath here to fire. And then what are these neurons doing? Well, they give rise to the cortical spinal tract and all the way down to the spinal cord. And this is how they kind of enlist a movement. Okay, so this is basically, and when you kind of have all of these electro going on here, and then this is how you can form a brain map of what area of the brain is controlling what kind of movement. And when they kind of conglomerate all of these areas together, then they come up with a very complete map of the human primary motor cortex, and this is why they call it the homunculus. It's kind of it's a very good representative of what your body looks like when it comes to the areas that are controlling what areas of the brain, or specifically M1 is kind of controlling the activities that's in your body. Now let's talk about the activities in M1 when what they are doing basically. So back then when they did a experiment on the monkeys, and so what they're doing is they have like electrode that's being stuck to the M1 of a monkey, and then they are basically looking at what happens to the cell firing activities when the animals are moving its arm in terms of the direction. And you can see that, so they basically arbitrarily pick that the right to be 0 degrees and then the left to be 180 degrees and so forth. And then when they looked at the direction of the movement, and when they're looking at this very specific cell in terms of the firing rate, and what they're seeing is that this cell, when it's making, when the monkey is making a movement to the left, it fired the most. And when it is moving to the opposite direction, let's say the 0 degree, it fired the least. And then pretty much everything else in between. And when they are looking at in terms of like the number of impulses per second, which is the number of action potential per second, and when they're looking at the direction of that, you can see that this cell really fires most when it comes to 180 degrees and very, very little when it comes to the 0 degrees. And then so from there, they were able to kind of calculate out when this neuron, this very particular neuron there are sticking the electrode to is the neuron that is responsible for this movement that when the monkey is making all the way to the left, when the monkey is making his or her hand to the left, okay, but not so much in other directions. Now the next thing I want to kind of talk about is this idea of vector. Okay, so what happens when you have a many cells that are firing during a movement? Because when you are enlisting a movement, it's not just one cell that's firing, because that's not enough to get your muscles moving. So there are multiple cells that are moving at all times. So what happens when the neurons are firing, and how this correlates to the actual movement of the cells. So let's say if they were to look at the activities of many cells in the primary motor cortex doing a very specific movement, they can see things something like this. So they can they'll be recording for cell 1 and then cell 2 at the same time, and then they can kind of predict what the movement is when they are calculating out the actual vector. So let's say if cell 1 in red is making this much activities, and then cell 2 in the blue is making this much activities, and then what is going to happen is that the population vector for cell 1 and cell 2 is going to be basically a combination of that. And then now in the other scenario, let's say if you have the red cell making this much activities and the blue cell making only this much activity, then the population vector for both cell N1 is going to be a combination of that. So this is going to create a different kind of movement. So this is the way that you can kind of use the kind of cells activity that's going on in the primary motor cortex to really predict where the movement is going to go in terms of an observable motor output. Okay, so this slide is just basically telling us what I have told you before. So this slide is telling us that the motor cortex activity is correlated with movement directions. So here what you're seeing is that the animal is engaged in two different kind of tasks. So in A, it's making the animals go from a center to the periphery, and then they're going to have the animal do a bunch of activities going from the center to the periphery. And then the second task is for the animals to go from the periphery to the center, and each one has its own direction. Okay, and then here they're looking at the same cell, and now let's take a look at the plot and what this plot is looking at. Okay, so this plot is basically each dot that you're seeing on the right is a action potential, and then so they would have the stimulus onset, and then they have the movement onset. Okay, and so the stimulus is basically when they tell that the monkeys start to make to move the arms one direction with the other direction, basically. Okay, and then so how does this particular cell respond? Okay, well, this particular cell is responding in the way that you can see that when it's going from the center to the periphery, anything that is involved with the downward action, so such as this, and that, this neuron really fires a lot in the movement onset phase, right? You can see that. But in the opposite direction, such as the arm that's moving up, right? And then you can see that in the movement onset phase, you don't see that much activity that's going on. Okay. Now in the opposite task, when it's going from periphery to center, you can see that this cell, this exactly the same cell, really still prefers this activities that's going downward. You can see that from the periphery going to the center when it comes to the downward position, all of these three, right? You can see that during the movement onset phase, there are a lot of activity that's going on here. But in the opposite direction, when it goes from down to center, which means this activity is going up, you don't see that much activities during the movement onset phase of here, right? So you don't see that much activities in the movement onset phase in the opposite direction. So this is telling us what? Well, this is telling us that one cell really has its own preferred direction, and then the actual movement of that direction is correlated with the motor output. So that was from just response from a single cell, as you guys can see, right? Now, if you have like a bunch of cells that are firing together, then basically what you're looking at is the population coding of that. So the population coding is when you're looking at many cells, as we said in the previous slide before, then when you have a population coding of that, then all of that cells that are contributing to the activity of movement is going to form a vector map, and then that's how the vector map together, all of these summed response that are in the primary motor cortex, that's how they kind of elicit the amount of the activities that each movement is going to partake in. So basically, all of these cells that you are seeing firing together, that's going to give you the very precise activities that is going on that you see in the peripheral actual movement in the muscle. Now let's take a look at how other areas such as the supplementary motor area also contributes to the actual planning of the movement. So what they did is they have a monkey basically look, and then they train the monkey to cue a signal, and then to have the direction of the subsequent movement as what you can see here. And then what they're basically looking at is they'll have a delay period first, and then so they have a cue signal, and then they have the delay period, and then they have the earliest go signal. And what they're trying to do is they are trying to look at how does this area, such as the primary supplementary cortex area, how they actually, how this area reacts when it comes to the actual planning of the movement. And then each one that you see here, all these arrows, these are the multiple cells that are kind of firing that predicts the population vector, as that we have said in the previous slides. And you can see that when the population vector uh, performs this way, you can, and then the subsequent movement of that activity is here. And then now when the population vector is like this, and then the movement is like this, and then the population vector is like this, and then the movement is this. Basically, so what this is kind of saying to us is that the direction of the population vector really predicts the direction of the forthcoming movement. Okay, and now let me see if this is everything I wanted to talk about in this slide. Yes, yeah, that's everything I want to talk about in this slide. Okay, now with this kind of knowledge, we can when we incorporate the brain-machine superfast computer interface, what we can do is we can really help the paraplegics to really gain like some sort of actions back. So what we can perform is something like as like the neurorobotics, and then so because it can attach the multiple electrodes in the primary motor cortex, and then use that activities to really make a machine move basically. And then so this is how people kind of you hear them in saying that, okay, if they have this electrode that's attached to your brain, and then if you kind of think that I want the cursor to go to the left, and then the cursor will make to the left by just kind of using the population vector that is in your brain. And because this is how the neural codes, because they're trying to decode the neural code that's going on in your supplemental motor area, and this way they can really make the neural robotics not just a science fiction anymore, because now they can decipher the neural coding that's going on in terms of the vector that is going on in your not in your but then in some organisms supplemental motor area. Now, what are some of the steps that are involved in coming up with neural robotics? So the first you need to kind of encode, right? So you have to let the machine read the neural coding in the motor planning areas, whether it's the supplemental motor areas or the primary motor areas. And then the next thing, what you need to have a neural coding deciphering, as I said in the previous slide. So this is using the computer algorithm to kind of analyze the motor planning by decoding the population vector. So you want to sample as many population in the cells as much as possible. And then the third step after that is going to be error correction. So if the outcome of is not what the animal or the human wants, then you need to kind of to because it's impossible to sample every single cell, right? And then because you can only sample like a subset of the cells because you don't have that many electrodes first, and also the spatial resolution what you're trying to get out of it is also not correct. So you always need to have the error correction. So whatever part that is not correct, then you can use algorithm to kind of compute that and say that, okay, I think this is where the missing data becomes, and then kind of fill it in mathematically, and then you can have the accurate error correction. So this is something that really takes a lot of computer programming to really kind of fill in the data. It's kind of very similar to the way that our visual system filled in the blind spot. And what is like the most logical aspect data that kind of filled in when it comes to the neural decoding, and also also what this missing cells and this missing link in terms of their population vector contributions to the movement, and this is how they can basically fill in. And then the last part is then they can go to the recorded site, including the M1 and MSA and the PMA, and also some other areas, and then what they can do is they can have a very big data and to kind of say that, okay, so when all of these neurons are firing, this is the kind of the output that this person with this animal wants to have in terms of its goal, a motor output goal. So what it can do is it can use this neural robotic steps in order to really in order to really have like an uh, accurate representation of what the machine is reading from the cerebral cortex versus what the output it is, what the desired output that they want. So you can imagine how this would make the paraplegic's life quality so much better, because now they can use these technologies, which includes like multiple electrodes, or maybe later on they can use something that is kind of very similar to the ERP that they're reading from multiple channels, and then they can just look at it from the areas such as the primary the premotor areas with the supplementary motor areas, and as well as some of the posterior parietal lobe, and then they can attach this to a paraplegic um, patient, and then they will be able to have this patient that was not able to move at will, and now they can have a machine just to do something for them just by thinking that I want the machine to go this way, I want the machine to go that way, and so forth. And when I want the machine to do this for me, and so forth. Okay, so this would definitely make the paraplegic's life quality so much better. Yes. Okay, so what have I told you so far about the cortical motor area? So what we see is that cells in M1 really prefer a very specific direction, and then the combination of the cell activities of the M1 contributes to a population coding that forms a movement vector. Okay, and then what we saw in the premotor area, and as well as supplementary motor area activities, all of these activity precedes the activities in the primary motor cortex. So the premotor area as well as the supplementary motor area, they are both involved in the planning, while the M1, the primary motor cortex, is involved in motor execution. And then the third thing that we talked about is that the encoding and the deciphering neural coding information in the premotor area as well as the supplementary motor area. This can really help with the building of the neural robotics. Okay, now next let's talk about the visual motor integration and visually guided motor decisions. Okay, so this is actually that was done in the monkey. Okay, so what they did is they were recording in this area in called the AIP. Okay, this is in the parietal lobe, and so what they did is Sakata et al. Did is that they were doing this while they were recording from the monkey areas. Right, so they have three tasks. They have the pushing of the button in the light, and then they have the pushing button in the dark, and then they have the one task that is involved in looking at the a button. Okay, and then you can see that there are three types of neurons that are residing in this AIP area. And so one that is a motor dominant neuron, um, in which that when they are pushing the button in the light, you see a lot of activities, and pushing the button in the dark, that you don't see, you also see a lot of activity. But looking at the button in the light, you don't see that much activities. Okay, and then there's the visual dominant neuron, in which that when you're pushing the button in the light, you see a lot of activities, and when you're looking at the button in the light, not pushing the button, you also have a lot of activity. But then pushing the button in the dark, you don't see that much activities. Okay, and then the third class of neuron is that there are visual and motor dependent neurons. You can see that pushing the button in the light, you see a lot of activities, and when you push the button in the dark, you also see a lot of activities. activities. And when you're looking at the neuron, there's also a lot of activity. So basically, this kind of tells us that there are at least this area in the AIP. There are visual dominant neuron, there are motor dominant neuron, and there are visual and motor neurons that respond to both aspects of pushing the light in, pushing the button in the light and pushing the button in the dark, and as well as looking at the button. Now let's take a look at some human data in terms of what the parietal lobe does, this area that we just talked about in the monkeys, okay? And so here what they designed is a task in which that the subjects, what they're trying to do is to match the fingers to the dot, and then the twist is that the dot sometimes moves, and then what they wanted to see how much of the planning can, how much the posterior parietal part really contributes to this matching, okay? And oh, so over here in the left, what you're seeing is the without any transcranial stimulation, okay? And to the right, what you are seeing here is this is with cranial stimulation. And you can see that basically the dotted line is this path to jumping target, okay? And then so what this means is that you can, and then so what they did is they're just trying to perturb the activity that's going on in the posterior parietal lobe, and then to see how much of the motor output of this can actually get perturbed, okay? And then the summary data that what they have is that because when they're trying to magnetically stimulate or to perturb this posterior parietal lobe area, you can see that with cranial stimulation, what the subjects were able to do, they were not able to adapt this very well. And so that kind of says that this posterior parietal lobe cortex is very important for visually guided motor decisions. Now, where do these neurons send their information to? Well, the AIP sends a lot of their information to the premotor area in the frontal lobe. So this is one of the direct connection that goes from the parietal lobe all the way to the frontal lobe, okay? So you can see that, so how do we know that, so what does the premotor area do? Now, as I told you previously, the premotor area does a lot of the movement planning, right? So what they did is that they have the monkey looking at the action of the PMA neuron, and then the next thing they have to do is that then they have the introduction stimulus that is on before the monkey start to do anything, and then when the target stimulus is on, then what they found is that as I said to you guys before, that this area of the neuron, they start to fire a lot before the animal take action. So that what that means is that this area precedes the activity of the primary motor cortex, which kind of, in other words, what the premotor area is doing is it's commanding what primary motor cortex should do. Okay, so this is just another task, and they're still recording in the visual premotor area during the performance. And so here the task is that when the it's breaking of a peanut basically. So when the person so when the person is breaking the peanut, versus when the monkey is breaking the peanut itself, you can see that the neuronal activity of these areas are really uh, a lot. Okay, so when the monkey itself and also when the person itself is breaking the peanut a lot, you can see that there are a lot of activities that are corresponding to both um, tasks. Okay, and now in C, when the monkey sees someone breaking the peanut, but then is cannot hear the peanut being breaking, you can see that this activity is still very similar to this two in front. Right now, what happens when the monkey is listening to the peanut that is being broken, but then does not see it? And you can see that the activity of this task is not as much in this phase, right? You can see that this cell really does not like that much. So this is kind of says that this particular cell they are recording from the premotor core the premotor area is very responsible for the self-referencing in the motor memory. So this is kind of saying that and this is a visually guided modality because when the monkey hears the sound, it does not respond very well. Okay. So since these cells all these mirror neurons are very important for basically the activities and also the social aspect of social mimicry and motor mimicry. So this came up with this idea of the autism, which is a motor neuron dysfunction. And then so what they thought is that the autistic patients, the way that they cannot really learn something socially by watching another person, it's because these particular mirror neuron cells are not functioning. And and this is also true when they looked at the EEG data from the autistic uh, uh, not children, but the autistic patients. So when they looked at the EEG data in the control subjects that do not have autism, what they see is when they are viewing other people as well as doing the action themselves, the cells are pretty much showing a lot of responses. But when it comes to the autistic patients, that when the autistic patients are doing the actions themselves, they are doing really well. But then when they are viewing other people, these exact cells that are supposed to work very similarly to the control subjects, they are not really doing that well at all. So they said that this mirror neuron dysfunction that's going on in the premotor cortex at least contributes to the social dysfunction or the social learning aspect when it comes to the autistic patients. And from those data, what they are kind of inferring from both the monkey uh, mirror cells as well as the activity that's going on with the EEG in human data, what they kind of suggest is that the embodied recognition for social learning really has to do with both like the learning of the language as well as the realizing social appropriateness and also observational learning when it comes to the actual dysfunction of the autistic children or autistic patients. Now let's talk about the planning and the execution of the motor outputs. Now last time we talked about the bottom-up versus the top-down processing, and now the motor output is kind of something follows a very similar suit. And when it comes to the execution, the of the motor output, how do we know that the things that are coming through are, let's say, internal loop or the external loop? Well, the external loop are the ones that are more externally stimuli guided. So you can see that. So in this way, the external loop is much similar to the bottom-up processing. And you can see that the information that are being involved, that are coming through, are the lower level areas, such as the cerebellum as well as the primary cortex. And so the parietal cortex, and the parietal cortex, they're receiving their information that's coming from the primary visual cortex as part of the where or the how pathway, right? And then so the parietal cortex, specifically AIP, they're going to signal their information down, not down, but front to the premotor area, and that you can see here. Now, so that's the bottom up with the external loop processing. Now let's talk about the top down or the internal loop processing. So these are based on your previous experiences and then or internal guided goal-oriented behavior that is coming from the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex initiates a thought, and then it's going to give information out to the supplemental motor areas, as well as let's say places like the basal ganglia, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture. And then all of these areas, they're going to converge their activities either from the external loop or from the internal loop, and they're going to merge the activity into the motor cortex, and the motor cortex are going to then form a specific population coding, and then it's going to execute the activity that's going on in that what we see in the outer world. Okay, basically. Okay, so this just pretty much sums up what I've told you guys in the previous slide. So external, a lot of it is coming from the sensory modality guided behavior. So you get things like the visual, auditory, proprioception, balance, and aspects like that. And in the internal aspect, what you're seeing are a lot of volitional movements. So all of these are involving with like goal planted behavior, and these are more mediated by the supplemental motor area. Okay. Now, in the last few minutes, I want to talk about what happens when you have these areas being damaged. So as what we saw with the object recognition, when you have the visually guided areas such as the IT or fusiform phase areas, then you being damaged, then you can have agnosias. When you have posterior parietal lobe damage, you can have, especially on the right side, you can have hemineglect. Well, what happens when we have these motor areas that are being damaged? Then you can have this something called apraxia. Okay, so apraxia is something that what you normally see. This is what happens when we have the actual representation of areas that are being damaged, and a lot of it you can kind of think of it as a posterior damage or an anterior damage. So this is going to kind of come with in two forms of apraxia. One is ideomotor apraxia, and another one is ideational apraxia. So ideomotor apraxia is more of anterior lesion, so that you see a lot in areas such as premotor area, as well as supplementary area lesion, and you can see that the ability to perform pantomime is basically lost. Okay, so and pantomime is basically when you're trying to say something like, "Oh, show me how you open a door with a key," and you can kind of imagine that without having a key, you can say that I'm going to grab the key here, and then I'm going to do it like I'm going to insert the key, and then I'm going to turn it, and then I'm going to turn the doorknob. So this kind of action is really lost when it comes to the actual ideomotor patients. And but what happens then when the object is there, then they can do this correctly. So this has to do with the actual activity that's not being so because as we said that the idea to plan a motor movement that is internally driven, that is kind of action oriented, this has to come from your memory, right? And because this memory aspect that is gone, so not having the object there really hampers this person's ability to perform a more internally driven uh, uh, internal driven guided movements. Right, so this is why when the object is not there, they cannot do this correctly because they don't have that help that is coming from the external loop that is more sensory modality guided. Okay, so this is something that you see a lot that the ideomotor patients are going to do. They're going to use something called the body for part substitution when the object is not present. They would use the extension of their finger as the key, so to speak, and and then they have something that's also called functional fixedness. Okay, so if you tell them, okay, use this pen and pretend that this is a key, and tell me how you would use this to open the door, and then they will use this to write. They cannot substitute the function of something for something else. So they cannot pretend that this is a piece of key, or let's say if this is a spoon, they cannot pretend that this is a pen. They just say they see this and right away they're doing this action. They say that and it's because for them, their ability to replace one thing, one function, one the function of one thing for another is completely gone because they don't have that interior aspect of the memory association to really help them. Now, on the other hand, what if there is a more posterior lesion in that, then you have something called the ideational apraxia. So this is basically the loss of the purposeful movement of the object related functions, and then so ideational apraxia is more of the the things that are being related, like the whole concept of the movement is gone. Okay, so this is how you can kind of tell if a person has a posterior lesion in the brain with an anterior lesion in the brain. You can basically ask them to perform these kind of movement, and you have a better idea whether or not they have ideal motor or ideational apraxia.